Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar about how to start a data masking project. My name is Maarten Urbach and I will be your host and presenter during this webinar. This webinar will be recorded. The recordings of the slide deck will be shared afterwards to all the participants and the registrants of this webinar. If there are any questions during this webinar, please feel free to ask them. You can ask these questions in the chat functionality of this webinar. At the end of this webinar, I will try to answer all of those questions that have been posed in the chat functionality. And with that being said, I want to start the real webinar. But before I do so, let me quickly introduce DATPROF to all of you. DATPROF is a software vendor that specializes in the test data management area. We try to achieve, and our ambition is to simplify getting the right test data in the right place at the right time. And we do those things with the help of our software tools. And we have several tools in that area that can help you. This is the DATPROF Privacy, DATPROF Subset, DATPROF Analyze, and DATPROF Runtime. And we are extremely proud that we can support developers and testers of large organizations across the world with our test data management tools. They might have different products and services, our customers, but they all share the same ambition to increase the quality of their hard work. They also share the same complexity of using various applications and have a large amount of privacy-sensitive data in their production databases. And for these customers that have been pictured in the slide deck, we create our products, but there will be many more to share with you later on. In the end, what we try to achieve by making test data easily accessible is we have the different products. We have DATPROF Privacy, DATPROF Subset, and DATPROF Analyze. And with the help of our runtime engine, we are able to automate all these test data processes and deliver them to you as quickly and as how you would like to use them. And we use those areas in different ways. So you can use it in the cloud, but also flat files. We offer all sorts of solutions to make sure that you have your test data available when you need it. During this webinar, I really want to explain to all of you how you can start a data masking project. It shall not be about the actual execution of the data masking process, but not how you can develop a template inside DATPROF Privacy, but really about what you should consider before starting a masking project. What are the steps to be taken? And I shall share to you some of the do's and don'ts and best practices that we've discovered over the last couple of years. In the end, every project starts, of course, with an initiator or a motivator to start something to do with data masking. And for data masking projects, it's most commonly, of course, that we think about data protection regulations. And there are many data protection regulations. There is, of course, the GDPR, which some of you may know or may not know, but the GDPR is primarily, of course, used in the European Union. It's a general data protection regulations. But also in the United States, there are updated data protection regulations. So it's expected that more and more data masking projects shall start due to improved or increased or there's a higher need for better test data due to improved data protection regulations. And in most cases, we still see that these regulations are the motivator to start a data masking project. There's also another thing that happens, especially in highly competitive areas. Organizations want to protect their competitive information to others. And that's also some of the reasons why people start a data masking project, to secure their competitive information, to make sure that the competitive information is masked so others cannot see it. The interesting thing is that if we talk to customers, we typically see two responses if they think about a data masking project. Either customers think masking data is really simple, or it is presented as really complicated. And in our experience, the truth lies in between these two worlds. Organizations who think it is too simple tend to forget a bit of the complexity. For example, they forgot that they don't live in a Microsoft SQL Server only world. So next to their SQL Server databases, they also have Oracle databases, and masking both systems in the same order is really increasing the complexity. And the simple script that was developed for the SQL Server database isn't really functional anymore in the data or in the Oracle environment. And then we haven't even considered other relational database management systems, or flat files, or NoSQL databases. So there are many different technologies that you might have to consider before defining a data masking, you could define data masking as simple or as complex. Considering it as really simple is not right at all, is not right as well. As well as you should not make it too complex either. Many people think that their organization is way too complex for data masking. There is some complexity involved also in large organizations. But in the end, if you want it, a lot can be done in your organization as well, even if you have a complex environment. I also think that in the end, a data masking project should be a well balance between the complexity and simplicity. This is also necessary if you take a look about usability versus security. At the start of data masking projects, an information security officer in most cases would like to make sure that data is really secure, is really protected. But by doing so, the masked data might become really useless or not representative anymore for testing. The other way around is that test or development organizations would like to have a low level of security and a high representativeness of their test data compared to production. So really simple masking rules would help them to make sure that test data is really representative to their production database. But then it becomes less secure. Again, it's really the effort, the challenge to make a well-balanced decision about what data should be masked during your data masking project and how you want to mask it and what's the level of security or protection you want to achieve, making sure that it's still usable. It's a well-balanced game that you have to play. So, the initiators of the project and the reasons of starting a data masking project are now clear. There are two main focuses what we see when organizations start a data masking project about the scope of a project. And there are different scopes in your data masking solution that customer wants to achieve. Either they have, well, I may call it a narrow masking solution, a really single source, simple solution, or they want to set up a data masking solution framework for their complete organization. If there is a software project with a narrow scope, then a narrow solution might be the answer. What I would like to say with that is that if it's a really simple environment, in most cases we tend to see in a narrow approach that there's only one system in scope. If we take a look at the framework, then there is a lot of more information involved and there's a lot of more things that needs to be done. So you want to deliver a data masking solution that can help you deliver data masking for all of the applications inside your organization. There are some pros and cons of both starts. You know, if you take a look at the narrow approach, then you have only one system. And this one system, well, there are different reasons why there is only one system. Sometimes it's again, maybe a little bit of bigger migration. You want to update your system from a version X to a version Y, and therefore you need to migrate. But then again, it's only a single system that in place and that you want to develop. That's the reason why you need masked data in your database. But then again, it's less complicated. In most cases, in these cases, we tend to see that generally there's only one database in place, or maybe there are at most 3 or 4 databases that need to be masked. Another reason why also the one system is in place if you, for example, want to deliver a completely new system. Then in most cases, it's also you have a narrow approach and you don't need a lot of things to happen, but you need to make sure that you have a single system that you can deliver. On the other hand, of course, there's the framework. And then you want to create a data masking for a full scope with all of the different applications that are in play. The benefits of a small project, a small solution, is of course that from the start you can quickly start. So you can quickly develop and you can quickly gain some information and some knowledge about your data masking project, or what do you want to mask. And that's also happening with the tools that you have in place and the system you try to mask. So because it's a narrow approach, a narrow focus, then you have a lot of things that you don't have to consider. The downside, of course, is that you might have a little bit of a tunnel vision. So you only will be focusing on that specific system. That's not really, doesn't really matter if that's the only thing, but typically we also see that customers start small, but they will, after some successes, they will say, you know, we can use this system also for all the other systems. So then they want to build a framework afterwards. And then some of the decisions that you have made for the narrow or the simple data masking solution might not be useful for a full framework. Of course, logically, it's exactly the other way around for a framework, because from the start you will introduce a lot of additional complexity compared to a single system. So you will need to know a lot more about the different applications that you want to mask. What we also tend to see, especially if customers are searching for a framework, is that they are looking for a one-size-fits-all tool. Which is sometimes a bit of a challenging, because in the end, what we experience is that there are so many different databases, there are so many different requirements that then will be introduced, that it's really difficult to find that perfect solution for one size fits all. Typically, we would like to mention, you know, if you can solve 90% of all your issues with a single tool, start with that tool and figure something out for the last 10%. Which is in most cases a quicker approach than searching for a tool that doesn't, it seems to be doing a little thing, but it's not really perfect for all the other stuff. The real upside of building a framework from the start is, of course, that you will have an understanding of all the needs and all the requirements that are in your organization. And in the end, there's no good or bad in your scope. It's a little bit what you need to discover before starting a data masking project. After you've covered the scope and you understand the scope, I think now it's time to set up your data masking team. How do you set up your data masking team? After I covered this piece, I will also talk with you about the IT landscape. What's happening in your IT landscape? It might be a little bit debatable if you should first introduce the IT landscape or your data masking team, because your data masking team might differ if your IT landscape is a little bit more or less complex, or more systems are introduced and therefore you need additional roles or persons in your team. But I like to make it a little bit more general so you have an understanding on how you should set up your data masking team. First and foremost, you need your data masking developer. The heroes in the end that you should need to make sure that you can deliver the data masking processes. These data masking developers typically, if you want to search for those people in your organization, what we would advise you to do is that these persons should have an understanding of databases, of your data content, but they also should be able to create a SQL statement. They should have an understanding of the SQL state, of creating SQL statements. They should understand how it's delivered. These are the people that you will need in your team to make sure that you have the right data masking developer available. Another really important person in your data masking team is a database administrator. A database administrator is really important because this person has a lot of understanding of what's inside the databases and how the database reacts and how it responds. and what kind of data is inside it and how you should be able to mask it. We also see that database administrators are also sometimes the data masking heroes. What's also really important for the database administrators is if it isn't the database data masking developer, it's really interesting because it's also really supporting if a problem occurs while running a data masking process, that he can easily help you to set up or help with problems that might occur. The other persons, and I think I will introduce directly two different ones, are the software quality engineer and the information security officer. The software quality engineer and the information security officer, I already mentioned it a little bit because it's the discussion about usability and security or protection. And they should really have an understanding on how do you want to make sure that test data remains usable for executing tests. And on the other hand, how can we protect it to make sure that we become compliant? This is a bit of the discussion that should really be done already or can be done right now to understand what kind of masking or synthetic test data generation rules should be applied to make sure that we become compliant and keep the data remaining for usability purposes for your testing. Another interesting role that should be in your team is the information analyst or the business analyst. This person is really important also for gathering information about how the application is working, what data is inside. He's the person that in the end will help you to create a functional design on what kind of masking rules should be applied on the different tables. This person is really making sure that every information should be available so you can create a functional design. And last, you will probably have a product owner or a project manager making sure that you keep to your deadlines, that the project is on schedule, and he will make sure that everything is in place when you need it. In the end, some of these roles are in the early stages of your data masking project. Some of these will be used in later stages of your data masking project. Especially at first, an information analyst will be there and the information security officer, but later on, especially the data masking developers or the database administrators have a role in delivering data masking rules and developing those and deploy those. In the end, if this is done and you have your team available, it's time to think about how is your IT environment designed. After we have an understanding on how how your IT environment is designed, we also want to know about what kind of data masking rules should be applied. We want to create the functional design, and that's probably the next step, which I will also show you during this webinar. But first, before we are able to deliver such a functional design, we need to have an understanding on your IT environment. This analysis about your IT environment is really interesting. It's really useful for your data masking project, of course, but if you have an understanding on your IT environment, it's of course also really usable for all other purposes or all different kind of purposes. Interestingly, right now also for this webinar is that we have to think about, but also in your data masking project, is that you have to think about what I almost started with during this webinar. And it is a little bit about what's the scope of your data masking project. As I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit about, do you want to deliver a data masking solution for a single system, or do you want to deliver a framework that makes a bit of the difference about what kind of analysis and how costly or labor intensive your IT environment design will be, how deeply you want to analyze everything. If you want to deliver a framework, you need to know a lot more applications logically than if it's a simple, small solution for data masking. In the end, it's relevant in both cases that you have an understanding on how your IT landscape, your IT environments are designed. And I will try to explain this a little bit furthermore with some simple examples. And this is also these information is really useful during the project, that you have something available and that you have an understanding on what happens. In my simple example, I have three simple systems: a CRM system, an ERP system, and a finance system where we might invoice people. And what's interesting, of course, if there are databases stuck underneath these application systems directly. In this example, these are stuck underneath the different application directly. So there's a direct connection, but there isn't any connection in between those. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but that's interesting to know. There also might be used an enterprise service bus in between, and that's also possible. And now you can communicate with all the different applications in your IT environment. But it is interesting for your data masking project and your IT landscape design that you have an understanding do we have an enterprise service bus, and how do we communicate? How does this enterprise service bus work? What's also interesting, of course, is to understand if there's a larger database available. In this example, I have a real large database in the middle in our ERP system, which is rather interesting. Maybe if we mask only this system and we delete, or we make sure that there's no data in all the other systems, there might be the case that the system can deploy the different data masking directly via the system. So we have masked already a database, and then we can use the mask database to deploy the different masking rules to the other system. I don't know if that's always the possibility, but that might be the case. But it's also interesting to understand how large it is, and maybe a subsetting solution might also be handy. The last interesting bit, which is also interesting to know, of course, in your IT environment, is do you also have external partners where you communicate with? And do they also have a database stuck underneath? And if you mask all the different systems on your own environment, then you might be introducing another challenge when you want to communicate with your external partners. This is interesting, of course, to understand before you start developing all different masking rules and how you should apply those. So it's interesting to know from the start what kind of information is stored where and how they will communicate with each other. What's also interesting, of course, and you should have an understanding, and this is a little bit what an information analyst also should do, is what kind of systems what kind of databases are stuck underneath the applications. Are there systems like Oracle, or are they all SQL Server, or is it DB2, or is it another database? Nowadays, we see all sorts of information, of course. We also see cloud solutions, private cloud solutions, hybrid solutions, but we also have NoSQL, flat files, clubs, blobs, and all this kinds of information is really useful to understand at the beginning of your project. There are many data-related issues that might occur which are really relevant to understand before you start your masking project. If you have this information available, then the next logical step to take is get an understanding on where privacy-sensitive data might be stored. Discovering where privacy-sensitive data is stored can be rather challenging. To understand and discover this information, we like to use DATPROF Analyze. DATPROF Analyze is a tool which helps us, but you can use any other tool if you wish, to understand and profile and discover where privacy-sensitive data is stored inside your databases. With the profiling functionality inside DATPROF Privacy, you're able to understand and find where those privacy-sensitive data might be stored. It can even be like a comment table where privacy-sensitive data might be stored. So that's rather interesting also to use when you search for the privacy-sensitive information. Logically, in most cases, what we tend to see, of course, is that privacy-sensitive information is found in a customer table or an account table or a policy table. And these kinds of tables are most commonly where privacy-sensitive data might be. But with the help of this analysis, but also with tools like DATPROF Analyze, you're also able to discover if there are any other tables where privacy-sensitive data might be stored. It's also really useful in discovering what data do you store is where key values are stored. And these key values are rather important, especially if you want to make sure that in your IT landscape, in your IT environment, that you're able to make sure that your data that has been masked in database A is in exactly the same way as we want it to be in database B. So you will have a consistent set of data inside your databases. What's interesting, of course, to know is what types of data do we look for when we discover data? Well, what we like to use is this slide. And some of you may know this slide from the past, but we really think it's rather interesting because in the end, what we see is that we differ data between identifiable data and characterizable data. Some of the information that can be found and was written down in this slide can also be found in public sources, especially the identifiable data. Not everything that's available in the identifiable selection should be found in public sources. But for example, a name can also be found in public sources. The characterizable data, it should not be possible that you are able to find these in public sources. Social security numbers should not be available in public sources as well, of course. But what's interesting, especially in the identifiable part, is that these types of data will help you to rather quickly identify a small number or one individual already in a set of data. Where if you would search on characterizable data, that might be a little bit more challenging. You might end up with a larger selection of customers that have the same type of characterizable data. In the end, if you also take a look at how authorities, protection regulators are looking at these types of information, what they tend to tell us in the end is that especially the characterizable data is really privacy sensitive. The identifiable data is in most cases less privacy sensitive because it just gives you a name from a single person. But if you also have an understanding on what kind of mortgages this person has, or what kind of medicine he uses, or what kind of religion he has or she has, then this is really more privacy sensitive information. So typically, this is more privacy sensitive, the characterizable data. What we try to achieve in the end by executing a data masking process is make sure that we make a cut between the identifiable data and the characterizable data. So we will deploy different kind of masking or synthetic test data rules on the identifiable data. So we will make new names, for example, and with that we make sure that a person is not the same person anymore, and all the characterizable data remains hopefully a little bit the same. And then it doesn't really matter anymore because the same characterizable data is referring to another person. So it's not privacy sensitive anymore, or at least not recognizable anymore to a real individual person. In the end, this is another reason why we like to start with identifiable data, is that it in most cases is way more statical, where characterizable data is in most cases way more transactional and way more dynamical. And that also introduces a bit more complexity, of course. If you do only more the statical data, then you will just manipulate a set of data and that's it. But for example, if you want to make sure that you will also have new bank balances, then you also might deliver all kinds of new payments or incoming money that's on your bank account. So you need to address a lot more transactional data than if you only do the identifiable data. In the end, that's what we try to achieve. It's not always possible to only mask or generate synthetic test data for identifiable data content. In some cases, we also need to make sure that characterizable data should be masked or synthetic test data should be applied on more the characterizable sets of data. In the end, if you have an understanding on what kind of data you have, this information can be used to, in the end, deliver you a functional design. This is in the end a deliverable that we want to deliver at the end of a project. So a data masking developer or the database administrator can do its job, create a data masking process to make sure that data can be masked and becomes compliant and usable. In this functional design, what if you want to deliver such functional design, you should mention on what column or multiple columns, what type of action of data masking or synthetic test generation rules should be applied. This in the end should lead to a compliant dataset. There are of course several ways and functionalities of doing so. You have the masking rules, but there are also synthetic test data rules. The main difference or the main reason why you should use one over the other is because how secure or how protected a column should become. Within data masking rules, there are different functionalities that can be applied, different rules that can be applied to make content more or less secure. For example, a scrambling or a blank functionality inside DATPROF privacy will create really secure data. Because in the end, we just scramble it, we just make access or we blank the whole value. But the flip side, of course, is that this new data, the scrambled data, is really less representative to production as it was before. So in your testing efforts, this might become a problem. There are also other functionalities like a shuffle, which you can also use. The shuffle means that we will replace the existing values and will transfer or distribute them in the same column to other values, to other people inside the same column. So everybody gets a new value, for example. The upside is that this will create a really representative test data set. But it's less secure and less protected than, for example, a blank or a scramble. In the end, for data masking, there's a set of rules that can help you make a database compliant. Sometimes a shuffle will be sufficient. Sometimes a column should be scrambled or it should be blanked. With the help of synthetic test data generation, it's possible to deliver an even more secure set of data, because you are able to generate new data, which didn't exist before, and therefore it's really secure and made it really possible. So if you want to, you can also say we want to shuffle, for example, last names, but you can also say we will generate new last names instead of shuffling them. It makes it directly more secure, but you also have some control over what kind of last names you want to use. Sometimes we also see customers that tell us we want to synthetically generate a full database, which is of course in the end possible, but it can be a really tough job to do, because if you empty or you will truncate a full database and you want to deliver all new sets of data for a full database, that might be a big issue or might be a big challenge, because in the end, if you have, for example, 1,500 tables and within all these tables, for example, on average 30 columns, then you have to create synthetic test data rules for every single column in most cases, which is rather challenging. So in the end, we like to think that the best strategy, the quickest strategy in the end, will be using both techniques to make sure that you have proper test data and compliant test data available. So use a production database, make a copy, mask it, synthetically generate it, so it will become compliant. So you don't have to deliver all sorts of data to all other different characterizable sets of data, for example. In the end, this is something how it should look like. So you will have a functional design. You will have, for example, you have the last name. You will place a shuffle on top of them, or a synthetic test data rule, but you will create a list like this, and this can be a list on any sort. So I just made an example, but you should create your own list. So in this case, I have a shuffle. We also have a synthetic test data generation rule on top of the first names, which we will generate new first names from the US and Sweden, but also based upon gender. So if it's a woman, it gets a women first name, and if it's a man, it gets a first name of a man. And there are several ways. What's also interesting, of course, is that we also have a group shuffle available, and which is really helpful, especially sometimes in postal areas where we can remain or we can keep the consistency available. So postal areas, if you want to shuffle them, we can keep streets, addresses, all sorts of information all together and shuffle them all together and replacing these existing values to other columns, which is an interesting functionality inside DATPROF privacy. And in this specific functional design, I also said, we want to generate new social security numbers based upon a certain sequence. In the end, the goal of data masking should be to make test data as representative as possible to production. Because especially in your software delivery process, it is really useful that you can rely on your test data. This is in the end the challenge that you are facing when starting a data masking project. You should decide in the end what kind of masking, generation or privacy use should be applicable. That's the end result or the deliverable of your first step inside your data masking process or project. If you have done all these different steps that I showed you during this webinar, I think you're able to execute your real first data masking project. And with that being said, I came to a conclusion of this webinar. I want to thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. And if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. If you haven't got the time or you weren't able to join or you want to rewatch this webinar, we will send you the recordings. So if there are any questions, please feel also afterwards, you can also reply on the mail with the recordings. Please feel free to contact me and I will try to answer all of your questions. Thank you for your time and I hope to see you in another webinar.